Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to Class 3 of PA 509. Hope everybody is doing well. And as we got through one snow, it looks like, well, here y'all won't get much. Well, we may get somewhere we are in Rocky Mount, but I still don't think that's necessarily going to be the case, but we'll just have to see. But thank you everybody for being here. Tonight, we're going to be finishing up chapter 1 in the text, as well as going into chapters 2 and 3. And I'm actually going to start off with a little discussion based on some economic information that was published today and talk a little bit about that as well. So we'll kind of get into that first and I'll add it to the syllabus here in a second. Those of you that are on Zoom, I encourage you to chat in as well as just ask questions as you see fit. Obviously the class, those of you who are here physically know to raise your hand, ask questions and such like that. First question I have is, what's people's opinion about me posting the videos on the YouTube, posting class videos on the YouTube? Are people supportive of that, or just get an idea?
Definitely.
Okay. I'm fine with doing that, and I'm fine with recording these. I just want to make sure everyone understands what the attendance guidelines are. Right now, looking at it, I have total about 22 people that are here. I think we got about 27 students, so we have a couple of absences right now. So just want to remind people to be present for class. Not talking to people here in the room or necessarily people on Zoom, but those of you who may be watching a recording, to please make sure that you're in attendance per the attendance policies. If you cannot make it, please let me know in advance. Again, I'm pretty flexible and I understand things come up, so that's not a problem. So let's go ahead and get started. Tonight, I'm going to start off, I'm going to make a change here. I'm going to start off with some economic insight, and we're going to talk about GDP, gross domestic product. The information for the final quarter of calendar year 2021 came in today. The Bureau of Economic Analysis released it. And it's really interesting, the fact that some people could look at it politically and say, hey, everything's great, but people who know a little bit more about it would be like, whoa, wait a minute here. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We won't spend too much time on it. Then we'll get into the 3 chapters. We're going to finish up our discussion on normative frameworks, get into the different ideologies that I really didn't cover last time. Talk a little bit about in chapter 2. We'll probably spend most of our time in chapter 2, which deals with collective goals. Something I want to preface, because it was asked by some students before the start of class, is people ask, about the mathematical equations or the various algebraic models that are presented in this class. Do you need to remember them for the purposes of examination or anything like that? And the answer is absolutely not. This course is more about this class, like most everything else, is about practical application. And I can tell you that, and I kind of use the example from Good Will Hunting. If you've ever watched the movie, you know how when they start the class, they start with this algebraic linear model of how writing should be, where they're asked to actually draw it on a chart. And the fact of the matter is that while some of you may have some advanced knowledge of mathematics due to your undergraduate work or previous work, I took calculus because I was going to start out to be an engineer when I was an undergrad. The reality is that when it comes to the work that we do in the public sector, just like in pretty much any sector, math plays a role in it, but math is not the key component of it. And particularly when understanding political economy, I think the variables examples that it shows can help with the understanding of it. But my interest is really to see how you apply the information. That's really what you're being evaluated on, not having a rote understanding of the actual theories or concepts themselves. Because in reality, when you're in the public space working, and whether you're doing that currently or you're going to be doing that, the reality is that people are not asking for your knowledge of various concepts. What they're asking for you is to evaluate actual policy or evaluate actual situations. And they want it in as clear and concise a manner as possible, especially the people that you will be reporting up to, whether those be fellow executives in your institution or organization, or the public as a whole, whether it's council or the general public. So I like that the information's in there. This textbook is a lot less math oriented than the textbook I used last summer. So it's definitely advanced works in that direction. So you're not having to look at graphs and charts as much. So I'm glad the teachers, the writer has gone through it the way he's gone through it. And at the same time, I don't expect you to there are going to be no questions on any exams or anything that's going to ask you to regurgitate it from a model perspective. Even the lecture and homework assignment, lecture and reading assignments aren't going to do that. I may ask some general questions for applicability, but I'm not going to ask you to say, please give me an example using a formula to show me such and such policy example. So I just wanted to cover that as well. So we'll spend most of our time talking about collective goals, spend some time talking about Pareto concepts. I may intersperse some class exercises. For those of you in the room, we'll kind of split you up. I see 7 here currently, so I'll have one group of 4 and one group of 3. And then I'll split the people up in Zoom accordingly in probably groups of 3 or 4. And then we'll go around to discuss the responses, and then we'll talk about the week 2 assignment. That should be the week 4 assignment, not the week 2 assignment. That should be the week 4 assignment. Like any good time cruncher, I copy and paste all the time. Yes. Oh, that would be great, wouldn't it? Sorry about that. There we go.
Thank you.
Thank you. Talk about, so for the sake of the people here in the room, I finally turned on the projection screen. So this is an overview. Everybody in here has had a chance to see it. I hope now get a chance to see it, and we'll go from there. So let's first talk about GDP. So GDP, of course, means gross domestic product, and really we wanted to define it. There's a very good definition: the value of goods produced and services provided in the country during 1 year. And it's really driven by, from a standpoint of how you would measure it. The way economists like to look at it is overall size of the labor force that is involved in producing, and then you times that by their average rate of productivity. So if the generic example would be that if we see a growth in the labor, if we see a growth in employment overall, and we see productivity stay the same, GDP grows. If we see employment stay the same, but we see productivity increase, GDP grows. Those are kind of generic. In reality, GDP is a little more complicated, and the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is part of the U.S. Department of Commerce, is the key agency that evaluates and reports on gross domestic product, and they do so on a quarterly basis. So each quarter ending at basically the way a calendar year, and then they report the results, and they do actually 3 reports for each quarter. They do an advance estimate, which is typically published before the end of the following month, and then about a month later they publish the second estimate, and then they publish a third estimate. So they do this because the first estimate, there may be some flaws in it. They want to present the second, and what they do is they present it from the standpoint of an annual rate. So whatever numbers they're presenting about whatever changes occurred on a quarterly basis, that information is annualized. So it's really extrapolated to an annual rate. So for example, where it here shows real gross domestic product increased at an annual rate of 6.9% in the 4th quarter of 2021, the reality is that 6.9% would be reduced by a factor of 4, not by a fourth, but by a factor of 4, somewhere like to a cube root, to a quarter. I mean, I forget what root of 4 is in terms, but y'all know what square root and cube root is, so think root 4, which would still be in the neighborhood of around 1.5%. So the overall economy grew overall by about 1.5%, 1.5, 1.6%, and then you extrapolate it out, and it comes to 6.9%. Following what was only an annualized increase of 2.3% in the 3rd quarter. So what that tells us is, when you look at the overall economy, that the final quarter saw a significant increase compared to the rate of growth that was taking place in the 3rd quarter. Now, if we look at it, this is not working. And so you can see here, looking at this graph, you'll see that overall GDP has been comparatively pretty steady, with the exception of 3 particular quarters, and those would be Q1 and Q2 of 2020, which saw significant declines. Q1 of 2020 was influenced to a certain degree by the start of the pandemic, and then Q2 was significantly influenced by the pandemic, followed by a significant recovery in Q3 of 2020, and then subsequent increases in throughout 2021. It was around Q2, Q3 that total productivity, if we were looking on a graph, and I'll show it to you, I'll pull it up from Fred. If we looked at it, that total productivity actually got back to the level it was at the end of Q4 of 2019. So even though you saw these rates of increase and adjustment, it really took a while for that to occur. And this kind of gets back to where overall, economically speaking, when we look at gross domestic product, we did see a V-shaped recovery. A little bit of a lean, but we did not have the swoosh like we've seen in employment. The swoosh means that the tail for recovery has been longer than the dip than we initially incurred, kind of like the Nike, kind of looks like the Nike swoosh. And we've definitely seen that with respect to employment. We still are several million low in employment compared to where we were before COVID in terms of total employment. And so this information here shows you that we've been growing at these rates. But again, a lot of this growth is simply recovering economic productivity that we lost initially from that sizable drop that occurred during the first half of calendar year 2020. So we look at, there's a lot of good information here, and I encourage you to go to the BEA website and publish it. But the reality is, the reality is that when we look at GDP in part, things change. And so, let's see. You see this title here. This is from Wells Fargo, one of the resources I talked to you about in week 1. And you can see it says 6.9% GDP is not screaming growth, it's screeching brakes. Very rarely would you see a statement that would say that, hey, we're seeing growth over 7% annualized. To just give you an idea, for the last decade, our annual growth rate has been predominantly under 3%. So we've been having what some people, and of course it became an issue in the 2016 election, to say lower than average growth, because growth up until 2008, prior to the financial crisis, was a little higher. It was typically above 3%. The 2008 to 2016 period was kind of volatile because of that financial crisis that was occurring in 2008, 2009. You see people would look at 6.9% annual growth and say, hey, that's great. However, they're looking at it from the perspective of components or contributions, because gross domestic product is comprised of a lot of different elements of the economy. It's not all one thing. It's a combination. And what they've done with this chart here is show that when you actually combine it together, more than 2/3 of the reason why GDP grew by 6.9% was due to growth in inventories, which kind of makes sense, because one of the things that we've been trying to do throughout this has been trying to rebuild inventories that were dramatically cut due to supply chain, due to the pandemic itself. Pandemic had dramatic impacts on manufacturing and production in this country, as it did across the world. And so it would make sense that inventory would go up. But as you can see here, all other components were only about 2%, or less than 1/3 of the overall growth factor. So what they're saying is, okay, this is great, but you can see in the last 2 quarters, we've had a GDP that's mostly reflective of production. Well, the challenge is inventories are great, but that value is not necessarily being translated over to the economy from the standpoint of consumption. Now, it used to be that consumption wasn't as significant of a component of GDP as it is now, but in today's market, a significant share of GDP is focused on the actual consumption of goods. And that's really a reflection of the health of the public. Because obviously the more consistent that people spend, the general belief is the more satisfied that they are with respect to how the economy is going, whether they're buying a house or going out to eat or whatever the case may be. Now, that's not to say that it should be overheating like we saw that led to the housing crisis 15 years ago. But the reality is that while we want to see inventory growth, we don't want economic growth to be purely dependent on economic growth, be purely dependent upon inventory growth, just like we would not want economic growth to be completely dependent upon consumer activity growth. Let me come down here. So what they're concerned about here, and again, it gets into this chart, what they're concerned about here is the consumption. And this is another measure that the Bureau of Economics Analysis does, and it's PCE, personal consumption expenditures. And what they're seeing is that while it has gone up in the last couple of quarters, they're starting to notice that it's going to start to subside. And the reason for that is that in these quarters here, we had significant federal stimulus. Hopefully some of y'all got some of that. I got some of it too. But the reality is that we're seeing that because that stimulus is going away, consumption is going to finally ease out. Now it's still growing, but it's not going to grow at the rate it was before. So there's going to be the likelihood of an economic slowdown. Now, that does not necessarily mean there's going to be a recession. However, something that is also having an impact on us is inflation, because obviously inflation for the general consumer is a pretty significant issue right now. Some of you may have already listened to the podcast for next week's assignment, where the principal guest is talking about how we don't think inflation is that big of a deal. And what I will say is he may be right from looking at the economy overall, looking at certain factors, but obviously for consumers, especially those that are paycheck to paycheck consumers, that it is a big deal. And we cannot discount that. And so I'm going to ask you, one of the questions that I'll ask in the assignment will be focused on that. So we're seeing kind of this situation occur where what they're really saying here at the top in their summary, when they say savor the flavor because it will not last, is the reality. They're saying this is going to be a great number, but don't expect these numbers going forward. Expect GDP probably in 2022 to be more in the 2 to 3% range if we're fortunate, and hopefully that stays. But we've got inflation as a pressure. There's still concerns about overall with respect to employment, it's still a good time for people to find work. But with the labor disruptions that we're dealing with, there's still a lot of that's still having an effect on productivity in ways that don't necessarily reflect inventory, which can affect consumption. So definitely some things we need to look out for. Are there any questions or thoughts that anybody has with respect to this information? Yes.
What are the other contributions to GDP?
Sure, let me pull that up. I want to get you So I'm going to hide these so that I can. So up here you have total again, which we showed. So they're estimating the total GDP for 2021 is up 5.7%, based on taking the information of all 4 quarters. So annualized in the final quarter, the rate was a little higher at 6.9. As you can see, personal consumption, which is a significant share of GDP. Overall, for 2021, it was up almost 8%, but you can see it dropped 3.3% in the final quarter. So that's a major one. Then there's that part, and this gets to a significant share, and that is what they call private domestic investment. This is where inventories play a role, because you can see here that in the final quarter, it went up 32%. It was about 9.5% increase. There was a significant drop in this area during the pandemic. And you can see the components of it. You have fixed investment, then you have the non-residential, and then you have residential. As you can see here, overall, in 2021, residential investment increased 9%. And that's reflective, of course, of the prices that we've seen for housing. For those of you who've tried to buy a home in the last couple of months, or at least looked at your appreciation on Zillow. But it's funny because in the fourth quarter, it kind of trailed off. Well, part of that's just due to supply constraints. One of the biggest issues we're having right now, and I will put it up there as a topic for group projects, is how do we increase housing supply? Because there are some policy factors that directly play against, and are significant headwinds against increasing housing supply, but they reflect some of the trade-offs that occur when you choose to increase the supply of housing. So that's something we have to think about. Net imports and exports is also factored in there. Just to give you an idea, exports are considered growth in GDP. Imports are serve as a reduction in GDP. And of course, one of the challenges we have as a country is that, generally speaking, we have a trade imbalance. That trade imbalance is reduced a little bit over time, but it's also increased over time. As you can see here, what's interesting is, though, that for the quarter, exports actually were high. We saw a higher rate of growth in exports than we did in imports. But overall, for the year, imports still outpaced exports. So that's technically, for economic evaluation purposes, imports serve as a drag on GDP because we're looking at overall domestic product production. Then you have government. Government is a contributor to GDP, but as you can see, it's actually gone down a little bit, and significantly on the federal side, because we had a major stimulus in 2020 compared to 2021. We had some stimulus in 2021, but it was not as significant as the stimulus in 2020. And more than likely, 2022 is going to show another negative number. One of the most significant, and so that dropped in the fourth quarter because, for example, the child tax credit was not extended, or has not been extended yet. So that's going to continue to play a role going further when we look at it from this perspective. We also saw a reduction in defense spending. One of the things that's been consistently a drag has been state and local. And this is what we've seen overall when you look at both employment information as well as spending information. State and local have still not recovered significantly as a result of the pandemic. There have been a lot of layoffs that have occurred in state and local government, predominantly in the areas of education. A lot of that was due to COVID itself and also subsequent other issues. There are also a lot of cases where there are a lot of open jobs, particularly in education again, but also in healthcare and other sectors. So overall, its actual impact on the economy has been heavily muted. Now, overall, when it comes to government, the federal government still has a greater contribution in state and local, sheer magnitude of money spent and associated productivity that comes from government. But as you can see, there is some effect. So these are just general, and you can go even further and extrapolate it even further. But this kind of gives an overall estimate, if you want to see that. Does that answer your question? Yes.
With the infrastructure bill, would you expect those figures to go up in the next year or two?
It depends on how the money is distributed. The infrastructure bill serves as a multi-year authorization. So the challenge, I don't expect you're not going to see a ton of activity in 22. You'll see some. The reality is going to be with a lot of these is that it kind of is a bell curve approach, in that really you see it in those middle years. So that would be like 23, 24, 25, 26, and going forward. But it's a 10-year, I mean, it depends on the way the plan is packaged, the way that agencies are able to dole out the money. I got information from our lobbyist a couple of days ago about the various grant programs that are being created for local government. But generally speaking, there's a lot of work to be done. So we're not there. Yes, Karen.
In looking at the chart that you had up, the pattern that was there for 2018 or early 2019, is that what we want to see? If we, I don't know. We know how much of this has been pandemic driven. Is this more of what we want to see?
I think what you want to see is growth. And I think for some people, what they would like to see is a higher level of growth. There's been some concern, and this again led to some of the concerns, because the real question is, how far can that growth go? Because when you start looking at it at an even deeper level based on economic sectors, you can argue that the growth is contributing to one area of the economy where it's not necessarily contributing in another area. And that was the argument that was made in 2016 with the election, was that in that certain situation, the political argument was made that we're seeing a lot of growth in the technology sector with information technology and the development of, honestly, intellectual property and the production of that, but we're not seeing as much in manufacturing, how that affects employment, how that affects local economies. And again, that is a very, very sanitized way of talking about what was being talked about during that time. So some people would argue that the higher economic growth is overall, the higher likelihood there is for a broader distribution of that economic growth across sectors of the economy. Morgan?
I just wanted to mention that I recently was in a class where we had a speaker come in who's in the financial sector of the North Carolina DOT, and they pointed out that with the passing of this infrastructure bill, it's not all of that money in addition to the regular operating budget. It's only slightly above the regular operating budget. So the public kind of seems to have this concept of huge immediate changes that are going to be happening, but it's really only going to allow for a couple of specific strategic projects to be added in front of what's already planned and being done.
Yeah, especially in transportation, because did he talk about reauthorizations of transportation bills?
Only vaguely.
Okay. So the way transportation legislation works at the federal level is that there are these multi-year reauthorizations. And the infrastructure bill ties, one component of that is the multi-year reauthorization bill for that. So what that means is, he's absolutely right, is that it's not like the Department of Transportation the U.S. Department of Transportation had a bunch of money and they added on top of it. They simply made the pot for that reauthorization bigger. Does that make sense? Slightly bigger in that case. But there is more money. What they also did was they added more money for other areas of infrastructure. So what you may see, one area that we're looking at, particularly at the city, has to do with water and sewer systems. And whether it's the need for expansion or the need for rehabilitation of those systems, particularly throughout the country, but also here in eastern and central North Carolina, that's going to be a big issue. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Thank you all for that. So let's get going back. So I thought I had a slide in here. So I'm just going to create another one. I thought I had a slide in here about to follow up on normative frameworks. So I'm adding it as we go along. So in this book, we talked a little bit yesterday, last week, about utilitarianism. And there's kind of a offshoot of that that's called egalitarianism. Anybody want to describe for me egalitarianism?
Egalitarianism, rather than focusing on total utility, focuses on equality. So either equality of opportunity or equality of outcomes.
Okay, what did you want to say? Right, the same starting point. So, but again, looking at opportunity and outcome. And again, that seems to be a significant issue that we have right now. Because throughout history, throughout American history, there has been this kind of discussion that really what our government can do is try to establish some degree of equality of opportunity. For the last 50, 60 years, there's been a further discussion by people in various movements about trying to extend that to this concept of equality of outcome. And really the question becomes, how do we get that? So when it comes to the definition here, we can judge based on 27 to 28, we judge the rightness and wrongness of a policy by whether it increases or decreases equality rather than overall well-being. And that's really the focus of egalitarianism. What are some advantages to this? We'll start off with advantages and then we'll get to disadvantages. But what could be some advantages of saying that we're looking at it from the perspective of equality rather than overall well-being? Yes.
I mean, just at a basic level, it takes into account like the overall well-being might be great, but there might be some people who just don't get any of that. So it takes kind of like a scale into account.
Okay. Okay. So in other words, it accepts the reality that you're not going to please everybody all the time. Okay. Would be focused on equality as a result of well-being be more efficient? It absolutely would be. If I know that my job is to provide everybody a certain level and I can deliver that equally, that's a heck of a lot more efficient and easier means of delivering service or implementing policy than it is trying to focus on people's well-being. Well-being incorporates a lot of other factors, and it does not makes for less efficient distribution. So that would be an advantage. Anything else? Okay, so what are some disadvantages or problems with this concept? Yes, Shannon.
That equality doesn't necessarily equal like equity. So there's this idea of equality, but not everyone is better off at the end of the day.
Right, absolutely. So we're not guaranteeing, it creates a challenge, and economists, this is something we're having to look at because we've created this idea of pillars in public administration. I think everybody has covered this. When I was going through graduate school 20 years ago, there were 3 pillars. There was efficiency, effectiveness, and economy, I think was the 3rd one. And then they added the 4th one, which is equity. And because I went to Georgia, we just put an arch over all of that. So the challenge is that when you talk to economists, and I've had this conversation with some public administration professors, and they say, yeah, this is something we need to figure out how to work on. They will tell you that equity and efficiency are not have an inverse relationship, that you cannot increase equity without decreasing efficiency and vice versa. And so that creates a challenge when we talk about it with respect to public policy. Because, and this is part of the communication gap that we're having, you have some people out there in the public that when they think about it, they think of efficiency and effectiveness and economy. Now you add equity, and equity has a direct inverse nature with one of those. You can achieve efficiency and effectiveness directly in some cases. In other cases, they have to be balanced out. And in some cases, they're inverse. But equity, at least in the mind of the economist, has an inverse relationship with efficiency. So what talking with the professors, what they would argue is that we've got to work on that because we need to find ways. We don't believe that it's absolute, that this is an absolute fact, that hopefully we can find ways going forward where we can achieve efficiency and equity together. Yes, Carl.
Another disadvantage is that to achieve egalitarian equality, you may have to forcefully take advantages away from people. And by doing that, you could have a net negative for society as a whole.
Got it, absolutely. And Bree, good one there, a possible lack of consensus on best policies or best methods to implement policies. So both of those are excellent. So I won't get into the deeper aspects of this, but we talk about equality of opportunity, and there's three different models, three different versions. Page 33. You have the bourgeois equality of opportunity that eliminates status restrictions, both formal and informal, on life chances. You have the left liberal equality of opportunity where you're eliminating circumstances of birth and upbringing that constrain not by assigning an inferior status to their victims, nonetheless causing them to labor and live under substantial disadvantage. And then you have the socialist equality of opportunity, which eliminates the inequality that arises out of native differences. So which system do you think we try to, which of these three do you think we try to emulate most in our domestic policy? I'm seeing twos in here. I'm imagining that that's true too. Melissa, I'll get to yours in just a second. But generally speaking, we try to focus on option two. That's kind of a left leaning. Even those on the right tend to argue for that to a certain extent. There are those who push for three. There are occasionally of those who push for one. Those are kind of more the extremes in our society, but for the most part, we push for two. So now, let's get to Contangentology. But first, let me look at Melissa here. I think this is why more cities are investing in equity research. I had a class project for the new class about social equity budgeting when I saw cities. Absolutely. And a lot of times, even it's looking at where money is spent geographically, looking at it in the past, try to address in the present and how it's spent in the future. We actually had that discussion in a meeting. We're preparing our CIP, and we were talking about updating tennis courts. And it's the situation being is that predominantly only on one side of town are tennis courts actively used, and they're actively using courts that need to be repaired. On the other side of town, the courts are not being actively used, but the argument could be they're not being actively used because we really haven't done anything to them in 20 years. So thought being, which way should we go? And what we basically agreed was, let's go ahead and fix the courts on both sides with the money we have. We just won't do the lights. So that's the approach that at least we're going to try with, is spend the money on the courts and not worry about the lighting and doing one court at a time. But go ahead and do both. So let's see. Next is, so we got Contangentology, Deontology, sorry. So what does Kant think? What is his he's looking at this a little deeper. What are his thoughts? Okay, good. There's well, that one was
Catherine.
Catherine, yes.
It's more about what's morally right and wrong in that situation.
Absolutely. His looks more on from a moral perspective. And generally speaking, we try to have agreement on morals, but do we always agree on morals? No. That can be reflected on on particular religious views. They can be based on based on how life experiences influence how life experiences influence our morals. There's a lot of examples like this, like the concepts of crime and punishment. You know, what is the acceptable punishment for crime in a moral society? And we have different views on that. So overall, was there anything that when we were talking about Kant, talks a little bit about this concept known as the categorical imperative, which basically is morally applying this concept of autonomy. Autonomy in general is highly valued in most of Western society, and to a certain extent in Eastern society as well. I'm not as familiar with Eastern society, which is why I don't have as much understanding of it, but Western society has put a lot of emphasis, even with the restrictions that are placed on it by various spiritual beliefs, on autonomy. And we understand that autonomy is very important, but he talks about here with respect to this, for an action to be moral, it must be that I would be willing to make the principle that motivates the action a universal law, and that we should never treat another person's humanity as merely a means, but rather always as an end unto itself. So, anyone want to take a stab at what this means? Yes.
So I think the first one in particular goes back to the point of like the private public morality, which is like you should, if you're going to make something apply to someone else, you should make it apply to yourself. Like
Right.
Behind like that veil of ignorance. Okay, it has to be I forget what the term they use is like a universal domain you would extend to all circumstances and everyone.
Mm-hmm. So kind of the golden rule, kind of a self-application of the golden rule. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. So the last one we talk about is libertarianism. And as he points out, looking at it from this perspective, it's going to be a little bit different than how y'all learn it. What do we mean by libertarian? For the purposes as talked about in this book. It's based on autonomy. It talks about, and it's on page 41, libertarians do not evaluate the merits of policies or social arrangements based on utility, but they instead are interested in maximizing human freedom. So autonomy to the greatest extent. Maximizing freedom, yes, very good, Jack. It's interesting though, because you could look at it from two different perspectives. And this kind of gets to some of the discussions that we have now, because what I would say is the difference between libertines and libertarian and modern libertarians. Does anybody know what a libertine is? Okay. Libertine kind of goes back to the at least my understanding of it, and I can be wrong, but libertines are generally thought of with respect to European society in the 16th, 17th century, 18th century, as those who basically felt they could do whatever they wanted to do. That they should be able to do whatever they wanted to do, and that there were necessarily no consequences to it. And that also meant that they felt like they could infringe upon, that they had the ability to infringe upon the rights of others. And that kind of gets into concepts of anarchy. It can lead very easily to anarchy. Modern libertarianism believes, as it talks about here in the book, that yes, people have freedom, but in order to maximize the freedom of all, there must be a system of rule of law. There must be a way to protect the rights of everyone. So one's individual actions are only restricted as far as how the impact that they would have on someone else, so the way that they would infringe upon someone else. So that's why modern libertarians aren't opposed to law when it comes to theft, murder, violent crime. At the same time that they would say there shouldn't be a law on drugs because my use of a drug in my own private residence, as long as I'm not affecting someone, doesn't affect anybody else. That's their view. And I'm not here to debate it. I'm just saying what their views are. What we also see in libertarianism is that there is a more right wing, which I've described, which is protecting liberty. And then there's a more left wing approach to libertarianism, which is about protecting opportunity. And saying that people, in order to have the right to pursue their own interests, should be provided with more resources. So that's kind of what we have in some of the discussions that we see with modern monetary theory, is that some people try to come from it from the perspective of, well, what we're trying to do is enable people to pursue their happiness and be able to pursue their options greater by giving them the resources to be able to do that. Yes?
So in that sense, it's kind of a parody almost in libertarianism, because if they want what you said in terms of like social safety nets possibly, but then at the same time, social safety nets a lot of times are provided by the government.
Yes.
So it's kind of
right. Left-leaning libertarianism doesn't argue against the government. What it's saying is that the government needs to be there to provide for the opportunity for people to pursue their own happiness or achieve autonomy. What they're saying is that there are certain natural impediments to a person's freedom. And what they're saying is government needs to be there to break those down, whether it's through social safety nets or through various policy initiatives, that there are ways that the government can increase liberty directly. Whereas the right-leaning libertarian would say the government can increase liberty, it can only reduce it. And so the government needs to do less. So it shows how libertarianism can be used, that a broader understanding of libertarianism, we can see that it goes both ways. Are there any questions or comments? Okay. So now we'll get into collective goals. If you go back and you watch videos of news shows and political speeches from the 60s and 70s, you hear politicians talk about what's known as the national interest or the public interest. They would always phrase what they were saying in those terms. You don't hear that as much anymore. They figure out different ways of saying it. But when we're talking about collective goals, what we're really looking at is trying to compare the will of all versus general will. Because the will of all is going to be fragmented. Each person's going to have slightly different preferences, different priorities, and so on. And so what we're trying to do in trying to establish collective goals is we're really trying to establish and identify a general will. The author goes through that with a series of tests of various concepts that focus on this idea of rationality. What do we mean when somebody's being rational?
in the theoretical sense, like they're making the best decision that like maximizes their happiness. And I mean, that could be a variety of things, whether it be now maximizing my energy level by drinking an energy drink, but like in the long term, I'm also maximizing my hopeful future success by coming to class.
Good, appreciate that. Yes, maximizing that people should make a rational decision that maximizes their happiness as they evaluate or maximizes value. There's another way of putting it. You had something you want.
Really pretty much touched on it, but
Except the energy drink part.
yeah, except the energy drink part. I don't need that right now. But couldn't you extend the rational model, like being rational, that like I'm thinking about like people in power who make decisions on behalf of other people and doing what a rational response would be. I guess it's more subjective.
So I see what you're saying there. You're talking about people in positions of power, because when the way he presents it's kind of I can see how when he presents this, the way the author presents this, is that it's kind of like saying that like everybody's involved in making decisions. And we know that that's not true, particularly in our representative form of government. When it comes to public policy, the public doesn't make most decisions. There's a few town hall governments out there, like particularly up in the Northeast, like the town in Gilmore Girls. If you ever watch that show, that's an example of a town hall style of government where the public all sits in a room and they make all the decisions, or most of the decisions. But most of us in this country at the local level, and especially all of us at the state and national level, we have representative government. So it's dependent upon the people that are elected to these offices. And in some cases, when they delegate authority to administrators, like how some of y'all will be, how they view it based on the powers that they're delegated, they make decisions. But the way that this is presented, it makes it sound like everything is done by the public at large, and we know that that's not true. So if we're looking at from a rationalness, you're absolutely right. It's the ability that a policymaker has to determine what they think is going to produce the highest degree of utility or value for who they're trying to serve. Whether that be a particular neighborhood, if they're looking at from a neighborhood policy perspective, or they're looking at, and again, that can differ because someone who's working in economic development may think, hey, my goal is to overall improve the economic condition of a neighborhood, while somebody working in community development may say, my primary job is to improve economic opportunity for those residents who are already there. And there's plenty of policies where you see those don't match up. So the reality is that when we're looking at it, people are going to make rational decisions, but it's going to be based on whatever their position is or wherever their perspective is. And so there are two conditions that we have to achieve in a rational decision. The first one is completeness. And again, one of the challenges here, again, and then for any two policies and a set of alternatives, that an individual policy decider will have a preference, and that would be in the case of a binary choice, which when we look at it, at least from a political perspective, is usually how things are presented. And I want to clarify this as well. In the political world, you rarely see us talk about more than one option. Sometimes, very rarely, there are two. Usually the binary choice is we either do X or we don't do anything, which is Y. Y would be status quo, nothing changes. So that's usually how it happens in the public policy. Now, in the administrative side, and on rare occasions in the broader public sphere, you may have more than two alternatives. And that's where this concept of transitivity comes in, that we're considering three policies. If you have this, draw it, but it's in there on your book. If we like policy X more than we like policy Y, and we like policy Y more than we like policy Z, then rationally X should be liked more than Z. Transit property, it's applying transit properties that you learned in math class. So that's the general concept of rationality. But as we talked about, we can't just go off of any one individual's policy decision. We have to figure out a way to take into consideration all of them, or whatever the group is that we have that has to decide upon policy. And that's where aggregation comes in. And there were two examples that were provided of aggregation. There's pairwise majority, and also known as board account, which is also known more in today's modern terms as ranked choice voting. board account and ranked choice voting. There are some states that have actually, like Maine, that have actually gone to ranked choice voting in various elections. So what is it? So when we talk about pairwise majority, here in pairwise majority, and it shows you an example on page 54 to 55. Both example, the example for pairwise is on 54. And again, the key to pairwise is majority rule, which is usually how most decisions are made, or at least how we think most decisions are made. So that's pretty self-explanatory. Whatever is the most preferred policy amongst all others by the majority is the policy that's implemented. And you can apply this with 2 variables, or you can apply this with multiple variables. What's the board account? Yes.
I mean, it's kind of like that, but I mean, if you have 3 alternatives, you basically give a number to each one. So you give 3 to the first, 2 to the second, 1 to the, or 2 to the first,
1 to the second, and 0 to the third. Yeah.
And whatever gets the most.
So it's basically a cumulative point total.
Yeah.
And you see this used some in situations where you have a large number of alternatives. And what you're really trying to find is what's the alternative that's the most palatable, ideally. So in the board accounts, like for example, this is used a lot of times in transportation policy. That when they're looking at how do we do something, and what this does is it's meant when you're dealing, typically board accounts never used in binary choices. But let's say I have 3 options. And when it comes to favorably and unfavorability, I've got option A where 90% of the people are favorable, 10% are unfavorable, but I've got option C where 10% are unfavorable and 90%, I'm sorry, 10% are favorable, 90% are unfavorable. So I've got 2 options. Now, theoretically, let's say I vote options A and C get 35%, but option A, well, let me do this again. My apologies. Let's say I have 3 options, A, B, and C. Let's say that 35% of the people that are making the policy like option A the most, 35% like option C the most, and 30% like option B the most. However, the likelihood is that the people who like option A do not like option C at all, and the people that like option C do not like option A at all, which means that 35% of them are going to give a 2 to A and a 0 to C, and 35% are going to give a 2 to A and a 0 to A, a 2 to C and a 0 to A. 30% of people like option B, and the people on options A and C will each give 1 point to option B. So based on this, the option that gets picked is option B. Because even though it's not the most popular top option, it's the option that everybody at least has some degree of preference for. So that's what would happen in a board, and that often happens in transportation. It also often happens in other rooms where you're sitting there looking at policies and you're like, well, what are we going to go with? And you try to go with the option that's the least, that has the potential for the least amount of criticism. Not necessarily the strongest level of support from a particular constituency, but overall, the greatest level of acceptance by the population as a whole. However, we do find some weaknesses here when we decide to apply a universal domain. What do we mean by universal domain? Let's try somebody online. Anybody else want to chime in?
I think universal domain was the concept of using the same procedure for every single issue that comes up, no matter what type of issue or style of issue it is, picking one procedure that will work universally. Right.
We try to be simplistic. And so our goal with universal domain is the idea that we want to be consistent in how we approach things. You know, there's a Peanuts movie known as Race for Your Life, Charlie Brown. Don't know if y'all seen it. I've been a huge Peanuts fan growing up, and they decide it's basically that they decided everything's going to be done democratically through a vote. So everything has to be voted on by this one particular group at the camp, and so that's how they do it. They use the same value, and you see in this example how that doesn't work in every case. How it doesn't work in every case to necessarily. It's a very interesting look at it. But what we mean here, again, is that we've got these different models, and these are and what was shown with you with pairwise majority and board account are just two. But you have this idea that there's two. But in order for it to apply universally, it has to meet three properties. And the first one is transitivity. What do we mean by transitivity?
So that was the one we did before where the opinions, like your preferences over, like if you have a preference between two things and another set of preferences, the first thing will be preferred for third. And that doesn't get like jumbled around, right?
Right, exactly. That ideally, going back to that, X is more preferred than Y and Y is more preferred than Z, then X will always be more preferred than Z. So the author gives an example on page 57 where this is not necessarily the case. Let me pull that up real quick. Okay. This is interesting. There we go. Where it's possible that in a pairwise majority system, that because of that it's possible that in this particular example, where again, we're using more than two variables. Again, this would not happen in a circumstance with only two variables. And again, this is why in most cases, most decisions are binary. But in a case where you would have multiple options, you can see here this circumstance where because of the variables associated with preferences, it's entirely possible that there could be a circumstance where, as you can see, X is preferred more to Y, which is preferred more to Z, which is preferred more to X, which doesn't make sense. And so as a result, we could have a problem here, which is what he points out to. So it's not so that means that's showing through the issue of transitivity how it's possible that even using the majority is not necessarily foolproof. Then we get to unanimity. What do we mean by unanimity? Pretty self-explanatory.
Everyone agrees on the ranking, then that's the social preference.
Right, if everyone agrees, and that's the social preference. Well, we find an issue here with the board account, well, I'm wrong. Again, this could be a problem because it shows here on page 58, it shows, again, a situation where we're looking at 5 variables. And overall, it's saying that B defeats A, C defeats B, D defeats C, and D defeats E. Thus, D is the most preferred alternative under the social preferences defined by this is the amendment procedure, which is similar to the rank. This is dealing with congressional amendments. However, we see a problem already evident. The amendment procedure defines D as society's most preferred alternative. Whatever the rest of the preferences, we know that D is greater than the rest. Notice that the members of society, however, unanimously, based on their rankings in that example, prefer A to D. So whereas D comes out in terms of voting, everybody still from a rank perspective says that A is better than D. So it's entirely possible that there could be conflict there as well. Then we look at the independence of irrelevant alternatives. So what does this mean? What does the independence of irrelevant alternatives mean? Yes.
Basically, the social preferences of X and Y shouldn't really depend on another variable like Z. So like in the book, it gives an example of being in a restaurant.
Yep.
And the choices are beef and chicken. You choose chicken. And then later on, the waiter says, "Oh, we have fish too." So then you choose beef.
Right. If an additional variable comes forward, which is irrelevant to the first two, it should not affect the choice. And ideally, again, in a rational environment, that would be the case. Of course, as we learned throughout this course and throughout life, not everybody's rational. And so it shows an example here in rank in looking at board account, where it shows ideally that under a 3 alternative system, we can see that they can evaluate those scores. And ideally, the scores on X and Y should not change, theoretically. Then you bring in a 4th variable, unless it goes to the 4th variable, but for some reason, 4th variable comes along and it changes the variable score. So the variable, because it's just the idea that by throwing an additional choice out there, that you offset people's minds about the original choices that are available. So again, that's a problem. So we see using these domains that none of the collective ways, none of the aggregation methods we have are foolproof. But there is one that is foolproof, and that's defined by Arrow's theorem. So what is a foolproof way of making a decision? What's the foolproof way? What method of selection is foolproof and does not encounter any problems?
Is it a dictatorship?
Yes, it is. Absolutely. Dictatorships. All your problems are solved. All your decisions are made for you. There's no evaluation of how things go. Everything is solved. It's easy. Of course, we know that dictatorships are not what we want by any stretch of the imagination. One, they don't turn out very well for a lot of people. In fact, they can turn out very deadly for a lot of people. And second, they're not as efficient or effective as we think that they are. There's a lot of other things that happen to them. So what Arrow then, what the author then gets into is, since we know that nothing works perfectly, we got to figure out what's going to work. And try to figure out the best alternative. And then he comes up with some things about that. And one of those is this idea that if we're trying to figure out what's going to work, we need to think about it from a different perspective. So we want that an aggregation procedure will satisfy positive responsiveness. So suppose we have some collection of individual preferences their society is indifferent between two alternatives, X and Y. Now, suppose we hold everyone's preference fixed, except that at least one individual who preferred Y to X moves X up relative to Y in their preference ranking. So we can say that the aggregation procedure is positively responsive if such a change breaks the social indifference, otherwise the deadlock. A situation would be indifferent if 50% of people want X and 50% want Y, but if one person changes, that defines the preference. So one can think of positive responsiveness as sort of a representativeness requirement. It says society is indifferent between alternatives. If we leave everyone else the same, any individual choosing to move X up relative to Y in their rankings should break the indifference. This leads to the focus that there often is in politics on swing votes. Those people, again, and this gets back to politics, in a political system, for a long time, the parties, Democrat and Republican, and again, we pretty much have a binary system in this country, were about 35% of the vote apiece, which left 30% in the swing. And so those were the ones that politicians are trying to influence with respect to their preferences. Right now, when you look at polling, this has changed a little bit, but in the last election, because of polarization, it had gone up to that much, so about 45% on each side. So it reduced the swing vote, which emphasized the importance of that swing vote in trying to sway from A to B or X to Y. So those are things that we have to think about. We also have to look at something else to look at here. Looking at the unanimity or indifference rule. So positive responses can matter in our ability to identify the most preferred alternative. If in unanimity or indifference, if every individual at least weakly prefers an alternative X to an alternative Y, and at least one individual's preference is strict, then society strictly prefers X to Y. So what that means is if everyone's kind of like, okay, yeah, we're okay with X, and there's at least one person says, I am absolutely for X, then that means, generally speaking, that everybody is strictly for X. You could say that that would be an example of our initial response to COVID. Generally speaking, everybody was kind of okay with 15 days to stop the spread. There wasn't really a lot of pushback on it. There was very little pushback on it. But it took leadership to say, there was a small group that's like, we're all for this, and we'll see policymakers, and they made that decision. And basically everybody fell in line. That's the kind of unanimity that you want in policy, that leads to that unanimity that you want in policy decisions. You know, hiring staff, you know, those types of circumstances where you need unanimous support. You're not going to necessarily get strong unanimous support, but if you can get at least everybody to agree with it, then you lean on those people who are the strongest for it to communicate and to make the push and to get people to follow along. But if at least one person strictly prefers X to Y, and at least one person strictly prefers Y to X, then society is indifferent. So if there happens to be in that circumstance where, yeah, there may be a lot of people that you have 100 people, 98 people weakly prefer X, one person strictly prefers X, and one person strictly prefers Y, that means that there's indifference. So it kind of gives you that idea of the power of one in a circumstance like that, because that one person not only balances out the one who's strictly promoted, but also that weak group. Which is why, like for the example, hiring a city manager. If you're hiring a city manager or if a city council's hiring a police chief, there's some places where the managers don't do that, but usually speaking, the managers do that. But if you're hiring a police chief, a city manager, you want there to be unanimous support. You don't want that one vote that says no. Because what that indicates is that there's you don't want that to happen. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Okay, good, we're back. We also then have this idea of, so we come then to this concept known as the weak dictatorship, which was presented by Maz Koldell and Sonnenschein. Suppose a society has at least 3 people considering at least 3 alternatives. And again, most decisions are binary, but in some cases you would have 3 or more alternatives. Then any aggregation procedure that always identifies at least one socially most preferred alternative and satisfies universal domain, unanimity, independence of irrelevant alternatives, and positive responsiveness is a weak dictatorship. So we go back to that idea of dictatorship, and then we say, if you've got at least 3 people making that decision, if you meet all of these requirements, in reality, you're kind of acting as one. So we're almost done with collective goals. We're getting there. Talk about with May's theorem and the concept of majority rule, which is kind of how we function usually as a society. There are elements to this. We'll go to page 64 with May's theorem. Suppose society has at least 2 people considering exactly 2 alternatives. The only aggregation process that satisfies universal domain, anonymity, neutrality, and positive responsiveness is simple majority rule. If a plurality of individuals strictly prefer one alternative to the other, then so does society, and otherwise society is indifferent between the 2 alternatives. So this is why, particularly when it comes to decisions made throughout our representative process, we pretty much rely upon majority rule. There are some circumstances where we choose supermajorities. Y'all know what those are, but typically we focus on majority rule in most cases. One way, again, that we then take that another step with the concept of the median voter. And again, this kind of relaxes that concept of universal domain. And again, this kind of allows us a little bit of flexibility to be able to evaluate, instead of evaluating specific people, kind of create a concept or a model where we consider whether people are more conservative or more liberal. And again, we're looking at this in small c terms, not big C terms. Big C, big L. We're looking at some small c, big L, small c, small L terms. And we can generally assess where people would stand on those bases. And then lastly, we have to understand the needs of intensity, because again, as Graham talks, finishing up with median voters, Gans and Smart's theorem, suppose society has an odd number of people and is considering an issue that's described by an ideology, which is typically where we use median voters, is in situations where we describe them as ideology. Social preferences under majority rule are identical to the preferences of the median voter. That is, society prefers an alternative X to an alternative Y if and only if the median voter prefers X to Y. So in other words, again, we focus in the median, which would be right here in most cases. Now, in some cases, like if that's the result, the median will be in the 55%. And again, that's kind of what we're doing with majority. So the idea is to try to find that median voter. So that's where you get the broader public kind of described in these generic terms like soccer moms, NASCAR dads, blue collar voters, whatever the case may be. Are there any questions with respect to the contents in chapter 2? Okay. So I want to do an exercise now. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to break y'all up into groups. So the 7 of you, you 3, actually you 4, and you 3. And I'm going to do the same with the people that are online. If you go to page 72 in your book, look at question 3. And then I'll give you 10 minutes. Actually, what I'm going to do is we're going to take a 15-minute break. Total time is 15 minutes. And I'm going to give, and so y'all have 15 minutes to discuss and do your break. Is that okay? Is that good with everybody? So the discussion time is going to be 15 minutes, but that also includes break. So let me go to breakout rooms. Okay, I think I got everybody. So the break starts now.
Like my environmental science undergrad, degree, political science class, I get that environmental law. And then I slowly started.
Okay, we're going to get back started in about 30 seconds.
I don't know. or that.
So you want to be like a.
That's a really nice headshot. This makes me feel like I need to be like educated.
I like it. They don't even matter.
Mine is just like, yeah.
Okay, so let's go ahead and talk. So got your question 3. At this point, given our discussion in chapters 1 and 2, do you find the notion of the public interest to be useful to be for thinking about policy evaluation? So why or why not? So who says yes? Who wants to talk about their group saying yes? If they did.
We were sort of mixed. We thought that, like, I thought that there is some use in it, especially the ideas of like the veil of ignorance and universal demand. You treat things, broadly fairly when you're making decisions. I thought that's a broadly good idea, especially when you're talking about things like public goods, which hopefully we could have a little more agreement on doing stuff like that. But just as much of the time we said no, it's a terrible idea.
Yeah. So anybody else want to talk about why or in a mixed way they think that notion of the public interest to be useful to think about policy? Okay, so why not? Let's go to somebody on Zoom.
I was in a group with Julia and Curtis, and we were decidedly against it. We thought it more the way at least as defined in the chapter of kind of like political navigation rather than any sort of evaluation of policy or even well, I guess I'll just leave it at that. It was more about that median voter idea rather than it was analyzing or evaluating the quality or usefulness of any policy.
So the author kind of wore y'all down until y'all kind of looked at it and said it's really about a small group. Mm-hmm. Okay. Curtis, Julia, you have anything else you want to add?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I think Jack summed it up.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anybody else have anything they'd like to add?
In our group, oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead. Go ahead, Lydia.
Okay. Melissa brought up a really great point about some of like the equity concerns that come along with sort of measuring public interest, and how maybe some people's voice has a lot more sway in determining public interest rather than others. So we didn't know if that was a challenge in actually measuring public interest.
Okay, good one. Karen?
Sorry. I mean, we had some discussion, and the way we kind of came to a conclusion was that there is good in public interest and consideration of public interest. And even in all that we've looked at, there's some idea that no matter what your filter is or your theorem or however you believe that you're working through a public interest, but the practical application is what proves to be difficult. And Morgan or Holly or Zach, please chime in if I didn't represent us well.
No, nothing to add from me.
Okay. Anybody else have anything they'd like to add? We had some good comments on the chat as well.
Well, I was going to say, I also think that seeing that we are public servants, it can also be just, I think, beneficial to include the public in that kind of decision making, because, we are accountable to them after all. So if a decision does negatively affect the public and they weren't involved in that decision making at all, then there could be negative repercussions for those of us who work, in public spaces.
Alex?
I just think, and I was in a group with Samantha, Bree, and Ellie, and the thing that kept me what Bree mentioned in her comments, the thing that kept me from being 100% on board, yeah, we should do that, is the fact that you can't, what happens when the majority opinion in public interest or public opinion is wrong? Because in the past in the United States, we've had a tendency to make mistakes. I mean, the whole civil rights issue was a thing. I would mention 2016 was a thing. The whole Japanese internment was a thing, and that was all majority opinion in public. That was to serve the public interest. So we can see how that can go horribly awry.
Absolutely. And then also Samantha makes a good point here. It is hard to represent everyone within public interest because who has access and time to participate in policymaking? And that's especially true of the median voter. So the chances are the person who has the most swing in the election is likely somebody who has the least involvement, because typically if someone is more involved, they're typically going to have a stronger preference one way or another. And as we see right now, we're dealing with a society where there's some very where there's some very strong opinions either way. And so it's that median voter group is smaller, they're less engaged, but they're really the linchpin in terms of figuring out where the majority goes. So what this does, from a practical perspective, it puts a lot of weight on people that are involved in the development and making of policy. It puts a lot of weight on them. It really reinforces I'm blanking on it right now, but the stewardship role that whether it's an elected official or a public policymaker serves in government. There's, we talk about, you probably learned in political science about delegatism versus stewardship. And delegates, of course, are typically responding to the interests of the majority of the people they represent, but it's the stewardship part that's the most challenging. And in a lot of cases, typically with policy decisions, most policy decisions, there's pretty much unanimous agreement on. Like if you go to a city council meeting, if they do 20 votes, there's likely going to be 18 of them where everybody's going to be in agreement. There's not going to be any question about that. There might be some minor questions, but everybody's going to vote. But there'll be at least one or two where there will be some differences of opinion. So it's those matters, and some have a tendency to be more favorable towards being delegates. But the reality is that when you're not sure about what your constituency or what those that you represent serve, then everybody becomes a steward at that point. And I like to refer to it in public, from a policymaker, when you're working in administration, is working without a net. Because there may be things that you're working on that it's very difficult to explain to elected officials, and it's even more difficult to explain to the public in general because they simply aren't used to it. If they spend a lot of time studying it, they would, but they don't have that time. They're busy living their lives. And you're faced with a situation, whether it be through a mandate or whether it be through some requirement you have through regulation, or be some need that has to be addressed to figure out what to do. So you're sitting there having to make a decision, and you don't know what the outcome is going to be with respect to preferences. You almost have to make a decision before preferences are known, if they're going to be preferences. Chances are there will be, and they will be communicated to you in a very not so friendly manner. And that's just something you kind of have to take as part of the process. So excellent work, everybody.
Sophia had her hand up.
Yes, Sophia.
Oh, all good. I was
Cynthia, Cynthia, not
like
Cynthia.
Oh, sorry, what was that? You can't hear me?
No, go ahead.
Okay. I was gonna say, like, on the median voter point, I always thought this was really interesting whenever it came up in classes of how much power that median has. But do you think this means that when we face a lot of pressure from the tail ends, I guess from voters in general, that are we less likely to see any sort of drastic change even during drastic times? Like, I think, you know, COVID being a drastic situation time period is a good example, but does that mean that we're unlikely to see drastic policy change even under circumstances like that, even under like timing circumstances, like, or situational circumstances? Because like people tend to vote in the same ratios every election. Is probably a fair thing to say. So I don't know. Just want I do wonder, because I think the tail ends, because our tail ends has tended to grow. I would say probably in the last 6 years, 7 years maybe now. And with that, how does that impact our ability to have more drastic policy change in the future, if that's what a lot of people advocate for on both ends?
Well, the challenge with more drastic policy change, particularly particularly when it comes to the timeliness of the change, is that there's a high likelihood for greater externalities. And our system is particularly designed, and I'm not saying the system's in full effect, but our system, particularly in this country, is designed to delay significant or drastic change to to extend it to incremental elements. So you're naturally running up against the way in which the system is designed to work, which is a more incremental approach. There have been periods of time where you've seen drastic changes. The 1930s, with the rise of the modern federal state, was one example. You can certainly say that what occurred in the 2010s with respect to healthcare was drastic change, and we've certainly seen drastic policy change during the COVID pandemic in certain ways. So there are times where that does occur, and even the civil rights era itself achieved some degree of change within a very short period of time, from the mid-60s to the late 60s. And then there's a tendency, however, though, when those things occur, that there's a reactionary response. You can look at the 1970s with respect to civil rights. You can look at what's happened in later years with respect to health plan. We can think about what may happen if the parties change Congress in 2022 with respect to what's happened in more recent years. So the challenge, whenever there is a more advanced policy, when you see more drastic change, is that it has a tendency that the median voter becomes more reactionary against it, one way or another. And so that's always kind of been a weight that's been against, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the change doesn't get reversed. In a lot of cases, the changes remain in place, but the progression of change is slowed down significantly. Does that make sense?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. Jack asked, I wonder if the concept of intensity of preferences has a stronger impact now, given the increased polarization over the past several years. It does. Unfortunately, the intensity is there. Unfortunately, what it also does is it prevents you from being able to find, if you're looking at it from a binary perspective, it basically puts you into a deadlock situation. So, for example, you look at some of the legislation, you look at the plans, the Build Back Better program that was presented to Congress, you got yourself stuck in a deadlock situation on that, where it was 50-50, where it wasn't even necessarily 50-50, because if it had been 50-50, it would have passed, but it was really 52-40, it was 52-48 because of Sinema and Manchin. And they were opposed to it for various reasons, mainly because they live in states where they would get voted out of office if they voted for it. They were purely going off delegate in those cases. And I would argue that it's really sad when you can't see, it's really troubling when Congress can't figure out a way to spend money. When Congress can't figure out a way to spend money, there's a real problem going on in terms of dynamics of leadership. And there's a lot of various tools and measures and levers that could have been used from internal political power to facilitate that. But even looking at any legislation right now, because with polarization typically comes a further fracturing and split where both sides, where the strength of both, where the size of both sides grows over time, and it reduces that middle. And without that middle, you don't have the ability to necessarily develop a preference one way or the other. It's only based on the size of the majority. And those majorities are short-lived when they do exist. Republicans have had majorities over the last 30 years, but they've been short-lived. And generally, the Democrats will have bare majorities like what they have in the House right now. They have a very small majority, but they have one. But it's very rare nowadays that you see, like what was the case when I was a kid, where the Democrats had pretty wide majorities in the House and Senate, except for a brief period of time where the Republicans had it in the early 80s. And the reason why was at that time, the Democrats were a much wider range of party than they are now in terms of their preferences. The Democrats not only represented the left, but they also represented the middle. The Republicans always represent the right because, well, that's what they do. But you had Democrats that were in the middle, and sometimes they would lean more Republican, but most of the time they lean Democrats. So you had, even though they were all technically Democrats, you had a good enough range to be able to achieve a majority preference to be able to facilitate policy along. But at the same time, they also voted with Republicans to pass some of what Reagan had. So it worked both ways, and from a policy implementation perspective. Are there any other questions? Okay, so let's go to 3. I'm going to share the screen again. Delete this because it doesn't make sense. So let's look at Pareto concepts. So if this book was being written by an economist, there would be a lot of graphs and charts in this section, showing you a lot of comparisons. That was not the case with this book, so that works to your advantage. But there's really 3 different terms that I want you to understand: Pareto dominant, Pareto improvement, and Pareto efficient. And these are the 3 key Pareto concepts. So what we're talking about here, what we're really trying to do is try to assess utility. It gives the example of, it uses the example of international trade, primarily looking at NAFTA, which was done in the early 90s, and it had an effect for 30 years. It had a significant effect on North Carolina. North Carolina, probably one of the most significantly affected states overall, both good and bad by NAFTA. But, so it uses that as the example. So what do we mean when something is Pareto, when a policy is Pareto dominant?
So that means that compared to another policy, it improves the situation for everyone and doesn't make it worse for anyone. Okay, that's true. If it's, or at least that's the view of it. That's the view. That a policy is Pareto dominant when no one strictly prefers the alternative, or in this case, no one prefers Y to X, and at least one person strictly prefers X to Y. And generally that means that everybody agrees that it is beneficial, that there's benefit to everyone. We then have the concept of Pareto improvement, where we start looking at alternatives, where there may be 2 options, in that you have an existing policy Y, however, preferences move to a policy X. That would be considered a Pareto improvement. And then that policy X would be considered Pareto efficient if no other policy is able to Pareto dominate. Now, does something being Pareto efficient improve? Does
does something being Pareto efficient always means that it's a Pareto improvement? No. So how would we apply that with respect to NAFTA? Based on the reading, how do we apply that with respect to NAFTA?
That having NAFTA and opening up free trade benefits some people, which could be efficient in a way, but at the same time, it can also affect other people, which would bring in the, I guess, inefficient, where it starts to like decrease the utility of others.
Right. So basically, what we have in the case of NAFTA is that overall, when you look at it from a macro perspective, NAFTA was overall beneficial for the economy. It did help grow gross domestic product in the United States net compared to what we would have without NAFTA. However, so it was an improvement. However, it did not achieve the efficiency because depending on what sector of the economy you were in, you saw trade-offs at a localized level that were either significantly positive or significantly negative. So let's look at North Carolina as an example. In the early 1990s, particularly in central North Carolina and in eastern North Carolina, a tremendous amount of the economy was focused in two areas: agriculture and industry and manufacturing. Tobacco and cotton were produced throughout central and eastern North Carolina, as well as some other crops, but those were the two key cash crops. You also had manufacturing, furniture produced in central North Carolina, and then textiles produced both in central North Carolina and eastern North Carolina. Due to policy decisions that were made in the 1960s, North Carolina had started taking some of the resources from its economic capital and was applying it to the development of supporting industry and technology, medicine, and other higher skilled areas. This campus radically changed. The campus at Chapel Hill radically changed. The construction of the RTP complex, as an example. And that led to the development of a white-collar, high-skilled economic engine that, as a result of NAFTA, saw a tremendous influx of opportunity and capital to continue to expand and grow and develop. And that, along with the development of the banking sector in the Charlotte area, banking and finance in the Charlotte area, and some advanced manufacturing developed in the Triad, really grew North Carolina's economy, along with real estate in the mountains and the coast. At the same time this was going on, a lot of central and eastern North Carolina, including where I am, Rocky Mount, saw our economies get dramatically cut. At one time, Rocky Mount had 18 textile plants. Today, it has none. Those textile plants, which were manufacturing jobs, were responsible for more than half of the city's of the area's half the region's total employment. Some of those jobs did move over to other industries, but they were not at the same level necessarily. Some were higher, but many were less. You also saw a lot of those manufacturing jobs go into the services sector, which increased labor supply for that sector, which, as it talks to here, helped depress the growth of wages in that sector. And it led to this area becoming a high profile area for warehousing and logistics as a substitute industry, which again is a job, but it pays lower compared to other types of jobs, even when Amazon's talking about paying $15 an hour. So this all changes. So as a result, even though North Carolina's economy has continued to grow, that growth has been relatively uneven. There are approximately 20 counties in North Carolina that are responsible for over 80% of the total growth that's been experienced in the last 25 years. Wake is one of them, no question. Whereas the other 80 counties have seen virtually no growth or have actually seen declines. Nash and Edgecombe, where Rocky Mount is, are two of those. And again, you think about it, they're only an hour away from each other, or less than an hour away depending on how fast you go. So you got to think about how that's happened. So, well, there has been a Pareto, efficiency. We've achieved Pareto efficiency through free trade. And at a national level, you could say it's been a success. At a more localized level, you can say it's not. That was a major argument in 2016. You had a candidate come forward who was able to convince enough of that group in the middle that I was talking about before, who happened to be in those areas that had not seen a Pareto improvement. And they're like, wait a second, I'm not getting what I want. And they voted him into office, along with a bunch of other stuff that shouldn't have happened. But so when we have a policy change, those changes will involve, one, an attempt to achieve efficiency and distribution. When a policy changes, there's an impact on efficiency. It becomes more efficient or less efficient. And then there's also a redistribution of resources. When the public policies, and we're talking about public policy here, but also private policy could be, corporate policy could be involved. So that's always the case. Because all policies do consist of an action and, in some way or another, a monetary transfer scheme, directly or indirectly. NAFTA did not necessarily involve the government moving money from one place to another, but the policy itself led to the reallocation of capital. And as he talks about in this book, find it. Page 80. This is the reason why the government's more involved in economic development at the federal, state, and local levels. The creation of trade adjustment assistance to help workers and firms adjust to dislocation that may be caused by increased trade liberalization. Justified now, as it was then, on the grounds that the government has an obligation to help the losers of policy-driven trade opening. Over the last 60 years, we've seen a dramatic increase in the globalization of trade. It's not only been beneficial to us at a macro level, but it's been also beneficial to other parts of the world. It's increased the standard of living in many parts of the world. Not always, but in a lot of cases it does. But at the same time, it does have trade-offs in the fact that there are people that are going to lose. Because under the economic principles, manufacturing and production of goods to where it's the most, should go to where it's the most efficient, all things being equal. Now, what have we learned from COVID that changes our opinion about that? Thinking about the supply disruptions we've had, what have we learned? Are the most efficient means of production always the most effective? Right now, there's a major push, and it was represented by a deal that was announced last week in Ohio, and North Carolina is trying to go after one right now to try to bring microprocessor manufacturing, microchip manufacturing back to the United States. There are very few places in the United States where microchips were produced. One of them is in Manassas, Virginia, where I used to work. There are very few places where this is done. Most of the microprocessors, microchips that are needed for the technology that we have today are produced in other parts of the world, predominantly in Southeast Asia or in East Asia. One of the challenges that we've had over the last 2 years, for one reason or another, has been that a lot of our manufacturing needs domestically are not able to get access to the chips that they need because of the global supply shortages. So a lot of these chip companies, many of which are based here in the United States, like Intel, are recognizing that they need to diversify their production to ensure that they're not going to be hamstrung by logistical supply disruptions like what we've dealt with. We still got the issue on the ports on the Pacific. There's some issues with air travel. Overall, shipping costs have increased significantly, astronomically in the last couple of years. One of the ways that we were able to have efficiency was because of how cheap it was to transport by boat from Asia to America. That's not the case anymore, or not the same as it was before, due to fuel costs, labor costs, and other factors. So what we now know is that we're seeing a situation where we have stretched out, or we've reached, in some cases, potentially a diminishing return point in trying to globalize our supply chains to achieve maximum efficiency. Which the net effect of that is that we see the potential for greater manufacturing opportunities, production opportunities here. But that comes at a price because they want to deal just like everybody else. Are there any questions with respect to chapter 3? These were the key points that I wanted to focus on in chapter 3. I mean, the rest of the chapters is good, but this is really what I wanted to focus on. The key points in the beginning were really the focus. Okay. So, for next week, first thing is text readings of chapter 4 as we move into the next section of the book. Then for additional viewing, I have added at least 2 videos to talk about externalities. I've added at least 2 videos on externalities and social dilemmas in the week 4 folder. Podcast assignment 1 is due by 6 p.m. I will have the assignment Google form link by email, hopefully tonight. Try to do it as soon as the class is over. Group project topics will be available for viewing tomorrow. It is first come, first serve. So each group needs to share with me their top 3 choices. If that makes sense. Are there any questions? Any questions from online? Okay. Thank you all very much. See you all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.